Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is our Chapter 18, Section 4 presentation on political and social changes that will occur in Europe during the Middle Ages. Specifically, these changes are going to happen mainly in England, but we'll also take a look at some changes that will happen in France also. Once again, you should read this here if you were there. That will help later on kind of explain one of the things. Here, the main ideas we're going to be talking about the Magna Carta, the Hundred Years' War, and the Black Death when we end this section. Okay, a lot of these are L to J terms again, so please pay attention to many of these things. Here are your key terms that will definitely be on the quiz. And once again, some of the things that are not highlighted, I will try to highlight them though in this presentation, will also be on the quiz too. So as you know, the last section ended with the Christian church and how powerful it was in medieval Europe, but it also then talked about some changes that were going to be coming to Europe, mainly political changes, and that's this section here. Political changes has to deal with government. Okay, so one of the very first things is going to be the Magna Carta. Now, by the year 1215, when the Magna Carta was signed, England had pretty much been in feudalism for about 200 years. William the Conqueror is going to bring feudalism to England, and then it's pretty much feudalistic society, so kings handing down land and things like that to their nobles. But what ends up happening over the course of these couple hundred years is that the kings are taking more and more from the lords and nobles, especially without the lords and nobles even knowing that they're taking it. If You Were There story kind of talks about how these nobles come back maybe from the Crusades and they find out, wait, who's taken all the trees off of my land? Well, it was the king, and the king wasn't willing to pay for it. So what ends up happening is that these noblemen finally got so upset by the year 1215 that they actually trick the king, King John, into meeting the nobles at a place called Runnymede. And they trick King John into coming there. He comes to this open field, and the nobles pretty much threaten the king with his life that if he doesn't sign this document, they're going to kill him. And the document is the Magna Carta, which in Latin just means the Great Charter. But the significance of the Magna Carta is that it is written law that the king has to observe the rights of these noblemen. The king can no longer ignore the rights. So it's a limiting of the king's power. And this is kind of the first time in history that you see a written document limiting the king's power. Now, some of the things that are in the Magna Carta that limit the king's power are also things that are in our government today. That when writing the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, our founding fathers will actually use the Magna Carta, which was signed some 500 years before, as kind of a guiding document. Now, one of the big things that was in the Magna Carta is this thing called habeas corpus. Know this one, it's not highlighted, but it's going to be on the quiz. And really, it's a Latin phrase that means you have the body, which today for us means you cannot be put in jail without knowing why you're in there. And that's what the king had been doing. He had been putting noblemen in jail and not, charging them with any crime. That is illegal here in this country also. Another thing that was happening, the king was actually putting people on trial, but they didn't have a trial by jury. It was really just a judge, and this would be a judge that was appointed by the king. They would decide whether a nobleman was guilty or innocent. Well, if this is a judge that he's getting paid by the king, of course he's going to rule in any way that is beneficial to the king. And that will be a change that also comes later dealing with these judges. Okay, so before the Magna Carta, a king could arrest people for any reason at all. Didn't even have to have a reason. He just didn't like you, and he could have you arrested and put in jail. And that's supposed to end, of course, with the Magna Carta. But most importantly, everyone had to obey the law, even the king. Now, let me be careful when I say everybody had to obey the law and all that. This Magna Carta was really about the king observing the rights of noblemen, not the serfs and peasants. Really, this doesn't change the relationship between the peasants and the serfs and the king. This was really between the nobles and the king. But it was still a start into getting some freedoms to the people from the king. Now, what this did then, this Magna Carta, is it set up a council of nobles that were now going to advise the king. Eventually, this council will develop into what is called the Parliament. Okay, Parliament is the lawmaking body that governs England still today. Kind of like the United States has a Congress. Parliament is the lawmaking body in England. And over the years, the parliament is going to take on more and more and more power. It's going to be opened up to more commoners, not just noblemen, but even knights and town leaders. So maybe even a serf at some point, peasants could rise up to actually be in the parliament. And there are going to be moments throughout history where the king could do very little without the approval of the parliament. Now, there's also going to be other instances in history where the king overwhelms the parliament and there's nothing the parliament can do. But the English are going to continue to keep trying to, gain more and more rights from the king. One of the things is going to be the parliament, to help ensure that people are treated fairly, are going to demand that judges are no longer selected by the king. That, like judges are elected. Things like that, which is how it is in this country too. Most of our local judges are elected by the people. And then that way, it is seen as a more fair chance of having a fair trial if it's not just the king selecting judges, because then the judges are just going to rule however the king wants them to rule. And this is, very crucial for our system here today, that we have what are supposed to be independent judges. All right. So another thing that's going to help change the political structure throughout Europe is going to be what's called this 100 Years' War. Right? This is going to be something that is occurring roughly the 1300s into the 1400s, and it literally lasts about 100 years. Now, that doesn't mean there's constant fighting every day for 100 years, but it's kind of a fight between England and France that, might go off and on for 12 years, and then it's off for another 5, but then they're back to fighting again. And what happened is there was this King of France will die in 1328, but he had no heirs to the throne, no sons. And there's going to be 2 guys that claim their right to the throne. One is a nobleman from France, and another one was this King of England at that time. Well, eventually it's the French man, the French nobleman's going to be king. Well, this upsets the English king, so he is going to lead an invasion against the French. And this becomes known as the 100 Years' War. Now, in the beginning, the English armies are actually very successful, and they're going to be winning most of the battles. About 100 years into the war, though, comes this young lady, a peasant girl from France, Joan of Arc. Okay, Joan of Arc is going to, maybe she's 16 or so, she's going to say she gets this vision from God. She gets these messages from God telling her to raise an army and lead this army against the English. And she goes out and does this. And she's going to rally French troops to her side. Now, eventually she's captured by the English. She's put on trial for heresy, which, remember, heresy is where you say things against the church's teachings. And she's actually killed by the English. She's burned at the stake. And she's only 19 years old when that happens. However, it's too late. The French have rallied around her, and they are going to eventually drive the English out of the country in 1453. Okay, so you can see this right here. Now, the results of the war is that there's going to be changes in both England and in France. What happens in England is the king actually loses a lot of his power. Parliament exerts more power. Parliament's going to have more influence now over the king. It's Parliament that pays for the war and things like that. And in France, it's just the opposite. In France, the king actually gains more power. In France, the king is the one that's going to be, funding the war, and the noblemen see the king as, standing up against these English, and they actually are more loyal to him now. So it was just the opposite. It creates more of a bond in France between the king and his noblemen. So just remember the opposite outcomes in England and France for that. All right, now we move on to the Black Death. Okay, now, as the 100 Years' War is going on, the Black Death is also going to sweep through most of Europe. The Black Death is devastating. It's gross, things like that. Now, there's theories, many different theories about the Black Death. Historians have kind of come down on the side that it somehow came from Central Asia, Asia, maybe from, crusading knights coming back, or the trade routes that are opened up after the Crusades. But they all kind of agree that, okay, some rats were on some ships. These ships come from the Middle East on the Asian trade routes, and they dock somewhere in Italy. These rats get off these ships. There's fleas on the rats. The fleas are going to get onto humans, and as they bite the humans, well, they're infecting them with the disease. The humans don't know they have the disease. They go carrying it off into the cities. It gets carried off into the countryside, and it's just going to spread and ravage the countryside. Nobody knows what's going on. It's very difficult. Now, as it says here, the Black Death wasn't caused by one disease. It was kind of a combination of several diseases forming into a plague. And that plague is just a widespread disease, kind of like what they're talking about with the pandemic that we have going on with COVID now. But you could see the disease once it had already infected you, but you didn't know that you had the disease until you were infected. And once infected, I mean, it was really gross. You'd get these boils on your skin, and then these boils would just harden, and then they would explode, and the blood would ooze out. It's gross, whatever. And it was a painful death too. And what happened? People were dying so quickly that they couldn't even keep up with burying them, having religious ceremonies, for funerals and stuff like that, where they just ended up putting them into these big pits, I guess. They would dig these pits, and they would actually just put all the bodies in there and cover them up, or even burn them, burn the homes down, burn the clothing. They would banish people from towns and things like that if they thought that they had the plague. It was very scary. It says here in England alone, about 1,000 villages are going to be abandoned. People are fleeing the cities because in the city it was actually more devastating because the people are packed in there so much closer to each other that it would spread so much quicker. Now, it did affect the countryside too when travelers would come out to the countryside. But in a lot of the manors that were run by the knights and things like that, they were actually isolated away from a lot of this disease, where a lot of those people, the serfs, really didn't suffer nearly as bad as the city folks did. And in about a 4-year time period, it's estimated that some 25 million, or about a third of the Europeans, died because of this Black Death, which is a huge number. I mean, it would be like 100 million people dying here in the United States in the next 4 years. Horrible. Now, the good that kind of comes out of it is this paragraph here, is that because so many people died in the cities, it actually breaks up the manor system and feudalism, because now the serfs are so in demand. Their skills are in demand. A lot of these people that were doing jobs in the cities are now gone. They're dead. And the serfs are going to start flocking to the cities and take over these jobs. Before, they would work for that protection from the knights. Now they're going to demand money. They're going to demand wages. They're going to demand working hours and things like that. So it actually, the Black Death, with all the horribleness of it, it actually springs Europe out of the Middle Ages, out of feudalism, and it does have a little bit of a positive by getting people to move away from the manors and off to the cities. Okay? There is a good part here. If you keep reading after the end of section 4, you can read about this Black Death a little bit more in detail as to how it would spread throughout different places and things like that. But it was a horrible time period. Fear drove everything there. They just didn't know how to handle it. Even the church is going to be, ridiculed because people believe that, the priests, they're the educated ones. They should be able to stop this, but they didn't have an answer for this either. So, the church is going to lose some of its power because of this Black Death also. Okay, so I hate to end that on a sad note and everything, but please pay attention to the things that were in here and be ready for the quiz that's going to be for Chapter 18, Section 4. All right, thank you guys.